In this video, I'll be showing you how to recreate this clock that you see here using HTML5 canvas. It's based on a clock designed by Dmitry Litvinov, hope I said that right, that you can see here on the right. So let's get started. Alright, so to begin, we're going to define some variables that will help us along the way. So first of all, you can see that I have my canvas defined already, so let's go ahead and grab that. And then we'll define a variable called size that will allow us to scale the clock dynamically depending on how large we want it to be. So this is just in pixels, and we'll do 800 just to make it really big and easy to see. I'm going to define a radius based on the size. So the radius is just going to be, let's initialize the width and height of our canvas to the size that we defined. And then of course we'll grab the context. Now, just for semantic purposes, because we're dealing with a clock and it will have a center which we will base all of our calculations off of, I'm going to define the center x and center y coordinates right up here at the top. So Cx is center x, and I'll just set that to the radius. The radius is size divided by 2, which is what we want, and Cy is the radius. I'll also define two sizes for the different lines that we're going to draw. So if I jump back over here, you can see that there's a thicker line for the ticks around the clock and a thinner line for the hour hand. So let's define thin line is going to be radius divided by 50, and super thin line is going to be radius divided by 100. Okay, so going back to our clock, we need to draw three separate circles. We need to draw the clock rim, the clock face, and the center circle where all the gears connect. So in order to do that, let's define a helper function, since a lot of this code is going to be reused. So let's call it draw circle. It's going to take a radius, a fill, so we can specify what color, start angle, and end angle. So for most of our circles, start angle and end angle are going to be 0 to 2 pi because that defines a full circle, but for the shadow here we're going to start and end at a slightly different spot, so that'll allow us to draw the shadow later in the tutorial. So draw circle is going to be pretty simple. We'll just use context begin path to start our circle. Context.arc. We will give that, so x coordinate of the center of the arc is going to be Cx. Center coordinate of the y is going to be Cy. The radius that we passed in, start angle, end angle, both of which that we passed in, and false because we don't want to flip the direction that we're actually drawing the circle. Next up, we can use fill style to set the color of the circle that we want to draw, and then we can call context.fill to actually draw it. Okay, so let's try and get something on screen here initially. So let's draw the rim of the clock first. So if we call draw circle, we can give it full radius of our canvas. Let's just do blue to start, and start and end angles are going to be 0 to 2 pi. So if I save that, we have our blue circle. So with fill style, you can actually pass in a gradient, which is how I created this design here. So in order to do that, let's use context.createLinearGradient, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So let's initialize our gradient variable and call context.createLinearGradient. And this takes 4 properties, so x0, y0, that's the starting point of our gradient, and x1 and y1, and that's the end point of our gradient. So if I give it 0, 0 for the start, that's going to be in the top left corner of the canvas. That's where our gradient will begin. And then if I give it the size and the size, that means it's going to end in the bottom right of our canvas. Now in order to define the colors that we want, we can actually use gradient.addColorStop, and the first input here is kind of like a percentage of where you want it to begin. So we're going to start at 0%, and I've predefined the colors that I want, so I'm just going to copy that over here. So that's just RGBA, 63, 94, 251, and then full opacity. And then the second one is going to be color stop at 1, so that's 100%. In other words, at the end of our gradient vector. And this is going to be RGBA 252, 70, 107, and 1. I can probably actually get rid of the opacity here since I didn't end up using it. And let's finish that off. So now if we pass our gradient in as the fill to draw circle, you can see that we have our clock rim, and it's looking great. So next up, let's draw those 2 other circles. So this is going to be the clock face. So the radius, we only want this to extend part way out, maybe 80% of the way, so I'll multiply radius by 0.8. Our fill can simply be white, and we want our start and end angles to be 0 and 2 times math.pi. So saving that will give us our face. And then let's draw the little black dot at the center of our clock. So I'll just make this consistent with our thin line size. I'll do radius divided by 50, make it black, and start and end angle are going to be 0 to 2 times math.pi. And there we have our center circle. Okay. So next up we have a bunch of lines to draw. So similar to how we have draw circle, let's define a new function called draw polar line. And this function is going to take in 5 parameters. So in order to draw these lines, we want to give this function an angle. So for example, if I wanted to draw an angle or draw a line at 0 degrees, we could give it 0. We also want to be able to control the start and end of these lines. So for example, if I wanted the line to start halfway between the radius and the edge, I could give it 0.5 and 1, and that would only draw that portion of the line, and then the width of the line and the fill. So let's start by defining angle, start, end, width, and fill. And finish with the comma there. Okay, so let's get set up to draw our first line. We'll call context.beginPath to declare that we are about to draw a line. We can set the stroke style to be the color that we passed in. That'll be the fill. I guess it makes more sense to actually rename this stroke style. just to make it easier to remember later on. And then we can set our line width, because we have that here already, and it's simple to do. So for the body of our function, let's start off by figuring out the x and y components of our vector. So const x component is going to be radius times math.cos angle. So that'll give us our x component. And then our y component is going to be the same thing, but using sine of the angle. So if we went ahead with that, we could basically figure out the start and end of our lines, ignoring the start and end parameters. But I think it'll be easier if I go through that first and then introduce the start and end afterwards. So let's just be really explicit and define start x is going to be the center, and end x is going to be the center plus the x component. Same way, our start y is going to be cy, and end y is going to be cy plus the y component. So then if we use the context functions move to, line to, and stroke, we can start drawing some stuff on the screen. So context.move to start x, start y. That's basically just going to be the center of the circle. And then we want to draw a line to end x and end y. And then we'll call context.stroke. So let's go through a couple examples here. If I call draw polar line with an angle of 0, and we can ignore start and end here for now because they aren't doing anything. I'll give it a width of thin line, and I'll say it's going to be black. And save it. You can see that we've now drawn a line from the center to the rightmost side of our clock. So this is great, but if we want to draw the ticks around the clock, so the 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, we want this line to stop at the edge of the face and start maybe a little bit before. So that's where our start and end parameters will come into play. So let's modify our start x a little bit. So if we multiply the x component by the start percentage, that can allow us to start this line at some arbitrary point. So if I gave it 0.5, we would start at x plus half of this line, which would be approximately around there. So let's code that up and see how that looks. So the start x is going to look just like that. And in the same way, the end value is going to be end times x component. And the start and end y values are going to be the same. So I can say start times y component and end times y component. Okay, so now if I start adjusting the start and end parameters, you can see that we now have a line starting at 50% of our vector and ending at 100%. In order to draw the 4 ticks, let's start at, well, we know we want to end at 0.8 because that's what we defined the end of the face to be, and let's say maybe 0.65 for the 3 o'clock one. I'll just copy that 3 more times, And let's figure out the values for each of these other lines. So for the 6 o'clock line, this is 0 here over on the right. We want this to start at pi over 2. So math.pi divided by 2. For the 9 o'clock one, that's simply just going to be math.pi. And for the midnight one, that's going to be 1.5 times pi. So I can just do math.pi times 3 divided by 2. And that gives us the ticks on our clock face. So last but not least, we want to draw in our hour and minute hand. I'm going to define the minute and the hour actually on the canvas element using a data property. So I'll say, let's say the hour is 10 and the minute is going to be, let's say 34. So once this is done, we should see a line coming out in the top left around 10 o'clock and then down to the bottom left around 34 minutes. So in order to grab those attributes, we can do canvas.getAttribute data hour and canvas.getAttribute data minute. Now in order to convert those numbers into an angle on the clock face, we'll start by defining the ratios of each one. So let's say our ratio is our variable, and that's going to be hour divided by 12. And similarly, the minute ratio is going to be minute divided by 60. Now, in order to convert that to an angle, we can say let our angle equals our ratio times math.pi times 2, and do the same thing for the minute ratio. So minute angle is going to be minute ratio times math.pi times 2. Okay, and we can again use our draw polar line function that we so conveniently defined previously to draw these on the screen. So let's do the minute hand first. And the start and end, we can just go from the center to about halfway. Let's see how that looks. And this can just be a thin line for the minute hand since it's going to be a bit bigger. And stroke style can just be black. Now, before I say this, I have to mention that there is an issue, a couple issues that we're going to have to address in this section of code. So the first one that I can mention is that we've done these calculations assuming that midnight here means 0 degrees radians, but in Canvas 0 degrees actually starts over here on the right. So in order to compensate, we're going to subtract pi divided by 2 to actually bring this around. So it's kind of like we're converting from polar coordinates to clock coordinates, I guess you could say. So let's subtract minute math divided by math.pi divided by 2. Oops, that's minute angle, not just minute. That looks a bit better. So that's about 34 minutes after the hour. And let's do the same for the hour angle. So draw polar line, hour angle, math.pi divided by 2. And let's make this one a little bit shorter. Maybe we can go 0 to 25% of the radius. Let's use that super thin line variable and maybe make this one a little bit lighter so we can differentiate it from the minute hand. The last adjustment that we need to make here is actually to our hour ratio. So for example, if the minute hand is at 30 past the hour, then that means that the hour hand is going to be halfway between, in this case, 10 and 11 p.m. on the clock. So in order to do that, we can just add the minute ratio divided by 12 to our hour ratio. And if I save that, you can see that the hour hand is now pointing where it should be, given that the minute hand is just over halfway through. Last thing we want to add is the shadow on the, bottom right half of the clock. So in order to do that, we can use context.global alpha and set that to 0.1. And again, go back to our draw circle function that we defined earlier. We'll say the radius is going to be the full radius. The fill style is going to be black. And now we want it to start halfway between 3 o'clock and 12 o'clock. So that's going to be math.pi times -1/4. And then we want it to end in this bottom left quadrant. And to do that, we can say math.pi times 3 divided by 4. And there you have it. We have our shadow on the clock. Alright, well, if you enjoyed that tutorial, I would suggest taking this one step further on your own and actually trying to get this to show the current time with a live second hand going around the clock. And if you'd like me to expand on that and show you how to do that later on, please let me know in the comments below.